Hi, I am Maryne Mutis, a clinical psychologist, and I will show you a summary of my thesis, the Lucideuil project, directed in France by Renaud Evrard and Marie-Frédérique Baquet, with the aim of exploring the phenomenon of terminal lucidity and its clinical after-effects. First, I will introduce you about what is terminal lucidity. Terminal lucidity is a term first introduced in 2009 by Michael Nahm as a separate category of exceptional end-of-life experiences. Although this experience is currently still the subject of debate regarding its form and manifestations, a synthesis of the existing literature allows us to identify 5 key characteristics. The first characteristic would be the presence of a previous altered state or thesis pathology that has caused losses of cognitive or functional abilities in sometimes an irreversible manner, as well as states of confusions or unconsciousness. The second characteristic would be a resurgence of alertness, consciousness, or mental clarity, with a return to a state of wakefulness despite previous impairments. The third characteristic would be the re-emergence of lost mental faculties or physical functions, such as communications abilities or a recovery of memory faculties. They can take many forms, with, for example, a greater willingness to communicate with others or a more present and renewed desire to eat. The fourth characteristic would be the unexpected and spontaneous aspects of this phenomenon, almost universally described as abrupt, sudden, or unanticipated. This character underlines the rapidity with which the manifestations can take place, as well as the surprise provoked by such changes in people whose condition was supposed to be unable to improve in this way. The fifth and final characteristic would be its occurrence shortly before death, with average durations predominantly from a few hours to several days. Case reports suggest a direct relationship between episodes of lucidity and clinical decline followed by death. Despite various avenues of work and exponentially increasing research, the current state of knowledge on this phenomenon still does not allow for consensual explanation. One main hypothesis explains this phenomenon as an adaptive response of the human body seeking to restore homeostasis in front of disease. This mechanism, which would then allow for a short period of improvement before further decline due to body's exhaustion. The most recent researches are therefore focused on the exploration of neurobiological mechanisms that can explain such recovery, in particular the neurological mechanism of brain death. Another hypothesis is based on the idea that terminal lucidity could not be explained using only these biological processes, and proposes that it's rather the manifestation of brain-free consciousness. In this approach, the conscious self would remain intact despite the disease, but would only be hindered from its normal expression because of its interaction with the diseased brain. This approach will also be attested by other paranormal experiences at the threshold of death. The only conclusion that can be drawn about terminal lucidity is that this phenomenon is a reality. The literature also points out that multiple factors seem to be at the origin of such a phenomenon because of the diversity of pathologies involved. Due to the long lack of interest in experiences such as terminal lucidity, few studies have attempted to determine the prevalence of this phenomenon. Recently, some studies reported 4 to 6% of terminal lucidity episodes. It appears that terminal lucidity is far from a rare phenomenon. This is supported by research on estimating the prevalence of the phenomenon through the collections of testimonies from relatives and professionals, which found about 42 to 79% of observation. As terminal lucidity unusual end-of-life experiences are eventually not so unusual and have been reported in many cultures. In particular, researchers in this field have focused on the impact of these phenomena, noting that they are seen as meaningful and spiritual experiences that bring relief and comfort, and that can then help families to better prepare for the coming death. Beyond these various benefits, there are unfortunately still reservations about such experiences, particularly in relation to fear of not being believed or sound crazy. There is thus a clinical interest in exploring such end-of-life experiences because of their relatively high frequency and the repercussions they seem to have, both positive and negative. And it's the aim of the Lucideuil project to understand these impacts. The central approach of this project was conducted retrospectively with two groups who attended to a terminal lucidity episodes. One group was made up of the patients' families, the other of the caregivers, with the idea of gathering complementary views on the phenomenon. 20 semi-structured interviews were obtained in each group. The participants also completed a questionnaire to obtain quantitative data on the course of the episode. A sample was transcribed and studied using interpretative phenomenological analysis. Through first data analyzing, this communication aims to present a draft on the supposed effect on the bereavement process of families and on the practices of professionals of terminal lucidity. The first observation is that terminal lucidity may allow families to cope with their loved one death and bereavement with less suffering and difficulty. Such an experience does indeed offer families the opportunity to find their loved one in a better state of health, sometimes with the possibility of being able to communicate and interact with the dying person again, such as saying thank you or farewells. By suspending death for a short time, terminal lucidity is a window of time dedicated to promote the recognition, integration, and acceptance of the upcoming loss, and thus the upcoming grieving process for the family. This phenomenon would therefore demonstrate the human need for communication to allow a more peaceful death. Indeed, we find a decrease in the fear of death and a calming of the dying person when such a phenomenon occurs and can be put into words, which then represents a source of comfort for families, noting the serenity of their loved one. On the contrary, terminal lucidity could significantly increase the risk of complications in the grief process. Due to its unpredictable nature, the phenomenon challenges the entire support process and the expectations of the relatives. Such an experience is most often described as very surprising for the family, with strong feelings of confusion, stress, anxiety, and even depressive states. Terminal lucidity would then undermine the preparedness to death that has been established up to now by removing the threat of imminent death and the need to prepare for it. The person's death thus appears as a cruel surprise for the relatives, with a death they no longer imagine, then perceived as much more sudden and potentially a source of greater suffering. The exceptional nature of the terminal lucidity and still incomprehensible also seems to accentuate the brutal and traumatic in connection with the impossibility of being able to provide an adequate explanation to cope with this unexpected event. Such uncertainty about the situation is indeed considered to contribute to greater difficulties for families in preparing for the death. In practice, terminal lucidity is sometimes already integrated among other indicators of end of life by professionals based on their clinical experiences. Thus, there is often informal knowledge shared by professionals where episodes of sudden lucidity are associated with an alarm signal that death is imminent. The possibility of integrating episodes of lucidity into care is often perceived by professionals as an opportunity to offer better care. This opens up the possibility of being more present and attentive to the last request or being here during the last moments of life. This phenomenon could then contribute to reducing burnout by improving the feeling of efficiency and professional satisfaction. It also seems important that professionals may be aware of terminal lucidity, so they can prepare themselves to welcome this possibility among the events at the end of life. It's indeed necessary for carers to be honest and transparent with families about the possible prognostic significance of terminal lucidity. Without this information, they may not be able to support families in understanding terminal lucidity, with the risk of being confronted with the suffering of relatives and the missed opportunities for a more peaceful death. Because of its surprising and inexplicable nature, terminal lucidity can thus be a source of difficulties for professionals when it challenges some care practices. Faced with people in an altered state of consciousness, there is indeed a risk for a shift to purely technical aspect of care with loss of the relational aspects. By reminding us that consciousness is still here despite the alteration, terminal lucidity would then create issues for professionals who are sometimes caught in this circle. This work shows that one of the factors that allows terminal lucidity to occur as a health or, on the contrary, as a trauma seems to be the possibility of giving meaning to what is happening at the end of life, in particular through relationships with loved ones or exchanges with professionals. Terminal lucidity would then be a privileged time for this presence and this speech, making it possible to transcend the meaninglessness of death and to face the loss with less pain. It's therefore essential to develop support for families in understanding terminal lucidity when it occurs, for example, by explaining this phenomenon or encouraging them to engage in dialogue one last time. Many authors insist on the fact that it's necessary to open up a dialogue around these experiences without fear of judgment. It's still often the case that healthcare teams themselves are reluctant to discuss such phenomena, notably because of the fear of being discredited as professional and the lack of training concerning exceptional experiences at the end of life. Dialogue requires promoting a better knowledge of the phenomenon among the care team and the relative, which can then enable family to better cope with such an event. Early intervention by professionals with family prior to the loss could reduce the risk of complication in the grieving process. Yet, professionals have an important role in demystifying as for near-death experiences and normalizing this phenomena in order to support the comfort they can bring. Thank you for your attention. Here are some references that could be used for go deeper in understanding terminal lucidity.